What?
Walmart even is their logistics.
Yeah. So an increase in demand for consumer products actually led to more rents going to the biggest firm. McDonald's also was another response to the baby boom, where I don't know if they're the best, but maybe they're at least the lowest cost producer, and they expanded nationwide. So rather than leading to a lot of entry in the restaurant industry, it actually led to exit that process, right? Professional sports during the 20th century are another great example of that. Gourmet food and celebrity chefs, the big boom in gourmet food, you would have thought, well, that's going to lead to tons of restaurants opening up. Well, to some extent it did, but it also led to these huge empires where, Rick Bayless takes over the whole Mexican market, because actually he's better and he invests in reaching lots of people rather than there being a bunch of Mexican restaurants that open up. Mass production of high quality design during the 1950s is another example of this. Rather than there being lots of craftsmen, actually the boom in demand for consumer products led to a few firms dominating the market and investing in the economies of scale to reach lots of people. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
So we were talking about how rent seeking earlier can create social waste.
Yeah.
It seems like some of these instances can cause some surpluses for kind of everyone on a greater scale.
Yeah, so that's what the example I was trying to give is that you always have to ask the question, what is the rent encouraging? If the rent is encouraging something harmful, then it's going to be bad. But if the rent is encouraging something beneficial, it can actually be good. We'll spend a lot of time talking about that later. Yeah, Jim.
Well, I understand your point that there's, like, for instance, fewer musicians or fewer athletes.
Yeah.
But it seems that there's also more people at the bottom competing to become those few musicians.
But I think overall, I think overall there were a lot more people who were pursuing careers in that. I mean, it's true, at a very young age, you might spend some time doing that, but in the end, you're not really going to devote your whole career to that thing, you know what I mean?
But I mean, is there some sort of social waste there where people aren't maybe developing because the rent's so high, like in the sports industry, parents want their kids to get scholarships in baseball or whatever, they're encouraging that talent at the expense of something else.
I think it's still probably more wasteful if they spent their whole life being a two-bit,
Really baseball player.
yeah.
But what about the high school kids who spend so much time focusing on basketball? They don't focus on high school either.
Well, no, I agree. I think that there's some waste to that, but I think it would be even worse if they spent their whole life doing that, which is what they might have had to do before there was broadcast professional sports. You know what I mean? Because everyone would have to go physically to a sports arena and watch them, and all those people would spend we lose their whole life to that profession, And I would claim that this might be the future of medicine and education, and your problem set gets you to think about that a little bit. Okay, so this is, go ahead.
So I hear that academia is also the superstar industry, but I was wondering if there's like the same technology effect where that allows for like superstars like reaching more people.
Yeah, I mean, your problem set will get you to think about that, I think. So, have you looked at the problem set yet? Problem 3? Yeah. Anyway, it's all sort of about that. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Would you consider the trading industry something like that? Because there's been a lot more technology, so fewer traders can take on a lot more products.
Yeah, I think that's like probably true with electronic exchanges and so forth. That's going to concentrate things more in a small number of firms relative to what went on when you had to be physically there on the floor to do all your transactions. So, Prashant?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about high frequency trading.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that those are both good examples of that. So this is called the superstar effect. It's if one individual can reach many people, then quality becomes the crucial thing rather than having a large number of firms entering, right? Markets may adjust by having more concentration among the superstars rather than having entry. And that long-term adjustment may actually increase rents at the top rather than going the opposite direction.
We talk about quality here. What quality is it really? Because with fast food or with Walmart or with mass-produced design, it's actually really lousy quality.
Yeah, what
people have access to, though.
Yeah, by quality I mean whatever the relevant dimension of quality is for the relevant audience. So, is Britney Spears better than everything else? Well, maybe not for you guys, but for the people who are consuming a lot of it, they view her as being better than the next person, or at least she has some network effects around people being able to talk about her, right? Whereas she's maybe the highest quality, lowest common denominator. And Walmart might sort of be a similar type of thing. Yeah. I mean, it's true that McDonald's is sort of crappy, but for that amount of money, I'm not sure that you could produce better food for that many people over a whole world. You know what I mean? So they've got sort of a formula which manages to create something edible that can be reproduced incredibly broadly, which might be very hard to do with any other formula. So, okay, so one example of this was a paper by Chad Severson, who's here at Chicago. And he said, well, look, it's hard to compare long run versus short run and how the adjustment effects are. So instead what we could do is look at different markets, right? Superstar effects work through communication, right? So one thing we could do is we could look at a market where things are very concentrated, where there's a lot of demand in one place, and another market where the demand is really spread out, right? And those will sort of give us the long run with more communication versus the short run with less communication, right? You can, look at these dense versus loose markets. And then you can ask the question, you might have, in a dense market, lots of firms coming in, you might think, right? Or you might have one firm serving a lot of people, right? And he found that there was even in the production of something like concrete, which seems like, like quality couldn't matter, it's just about cost, a very strong effect of this. So he found that if you go to markets that have above the median density, you actually eliminate a lot of these low firms, and you just focus on the few firms that have the highest productivity. And this has become a big focus of the international trade literature recently. So Mark Mellitz's paper, which is like probably the most cited paper of the last decades, is just about this effect. It's about the fact that when you get bigger markets, when you get more international trade, you actually get exit. And you get more focus on the people who are the absolute highest quality. And so it's an empirical question in different sectors whether the communication effect or the entry effect is going to dominate. Now, we could go even further than this. So even the assumption that there will be more entry in the long run than there is in the short run depends on the notion that talent to allow you to enter is durable. Because there's some fixed cost of adoption or some fixed cost of getting into a market. And once you've paid that, it's cheap to imitate. And this is often plausible. So to reverse engineer something and to set up something that imitates the iPhone takes a fixed cost. Studying to enter a profession that's in high demand takes a fixed cost. Navigating initial regulatory or bureaucratic barriers takes a fixed cost. But there's some cases where this is unlikely. So for example, if there's a rise in the demand for basketball, maybe that'll cause some more people to enter, but there's really a limited supply of people who can be the best basketball players, right? Adaptability and innovative capacity are very hard to learn. And in the internet age, it's so easy to enter so quickly into many markets that it's not that clear that in the long run you're going to get that much more entry than you get in a relatively short run, right? Oftentimes not the most important element in creating talent. And in fact, sometimes time can even work against entry. So, for example, if talent or will to enter an industry is actually storable rather than durable, then in fact you can get more entry in the short run than you do in the long run. And that might sound a little bit strange, but there's actually some very clear examples of this. Can anyone think of one? Vershawn, did you already look at the slides?
No, I mean...
Or you remember from last year, maybe. But anyways, go ahead. Yeah,
well,
what's
just think
your...
of the investment banking industry.
Yeah?
And, like, people stay there for, like, 2 years. And
Yeah, I think that's a very good example. How about you, Eric?
Well, it seems like any industry where, like, the people in it just get, like, overworked and, like, burnt out after a while. Like, emergency room doctors or, like, I don't know, like, charity work or something.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's lots of areas where someone might not want to do it for their whole life. So if there's an increase in demand, someone will spend a couple years there and then leave. And it will actually, if there's a long-term increase, no one would go into it anymore. So I think the best example of this is charitable giving for disaster-struck regions. If a really poor region of the world gets hit by a disaster, people usually give a lot of money to that region. But areas that are just poor and are probably even worse than the disaster-struck region almost never get any donation. Because people get tired of giving money to that area, right? And so that's an area where a short-run shock will actually generate a much bigger response than a long-run shock will, right? Another example is like industries that boom, but people only want to spend a few years in them. Or, imagine that, China is booming. People might want to go and spend a couple years to start a business in China, but they might not want to live their whole life there. And so it's not completely obvious that China booming will, in the long run, lead to more people moving to China to work there than in the short run. Okay. Now, so I think what this means is that the distribution of talent is really an absolutely crucial thing because it's going to determine the distribution of these rents. And if that's more important than the long run entry, it's going to determine many, many things. So, in fact, if things are more spread out at the top, that's going to mean that there's a lot more reason to innovate to allow the top people to reach more people. If things are compressed, well, it might be better to just allow more entry to take place. So the margins on which markets adjust all depend on how talent is distributed. But note, it's not the entire distribution that matters. It's only the people who select into the industry who will be the people at the top. So if there are some people that are very good, but there's a large number of them, it's almost like there is very little distribution of talent. It really matters if there's like some class of people who's great, then everything is sort of like free entry. On the other hand, if even at the top, there's still some people who are much better than the next people, those are the cases where you're going to get things like the superstar effect mattering a lot. So a simple way to formalize this idea is the notion of a hazard rate. And Daiichi, what's the definition of the hazard rate? If we let the CDF be capital F and the PDF be little f, what's the hazard rate?
Is it little f over big F?
Almost. Oh yeah, yes it is. No, no, almost. Almost.
Little f over 1 minus.
Yes, it's little f over 1 minus big F. So it's how many people are above, how many people are at a given level divided by how many people are above that level, right? And if this increases as you get higher up the distribution, then you have what's called thin tails. On the other hand, if it decreases, you have what's called thick tails. So typical thin-tailed distributions are like anything which has an upper bound on the distribution is going to be very thin-tailed. The normal distribution and most standard statistical distributions that you're used to with a single hump are thin-tailed. How about some fat-tailed distributions? Tony, Leon, is he here? Tony? No. Anyone else want to give some examples of fat-tailed distributions? Yeah. Power laws are a great example. Pareto, log normal distributions, etc. So one way that I like to think about tails is that this is basically like how many people are like you divided by how many people are better than you, right? And given that almost all of us think in relative terms, that's going to sort of feel to us subjectively like, is this a thing that I'm doing or a profession where as I get better, I sort of feel like I've mastered things? That is like when there's a thin-tailed distribution of talent. So like driving a car is sort of like that. Initially, you feel really bad about it. As you get better, you sort of feel like, I've sort of mastered it. And the reason is that there's a lot more people who are similar to you than there are people